Hello! Super short video today. Now, if you're just becoming interested in learning how to play jazz guitar, I'm probably not the person to teach you. However, if you are interested in some of the basic techniques that are used by somebody like Wes Montgomery, or somebody who is influenced by Wes Montgomery, you probably want to know how Wes played his octaves. Because his solos tended to follow a standard kind of routine. He would start with single note lines, and then he would build up to a climax, which involved these very characteristic octaves that he would play in a particular way with the right hand, or with the left hand rather, which I'm about to show you. And he of course played it with his thumb. I use a thumb pick on the right hand. And this way of playing octaves is most associated with Wes Montgomery, but pretty well every jazz guitarist has experimented with it. Even I like to think of the best example for me is Wes Montgomery's biggest rival was Grant Green, particularly into the late 60s. And on the famous Grant Green album, Live at the Lighthouse, on the track called Fancy Free, the Donald Byrd tune, you can hear Grant Green play a long sequence of octaves exactly the same way that Wes Montgomery might have played them in the same setting. So anyway, how do you do it? How did Wes do it? It's actually extremely easy. So the one thing that I'll start with is essentially is that for the most part Wes played his octaves on the G string and the E string, the high E string, and the way that he arrived at the shape was he's basically playing a D shape. It's strange to say this because he's actually playing the fifth of the D, but if you start off with the D chord, standard open chord, like so, and if you're playing for accents, you might suspend the D. And then if you're trying to wrap up a tune, you'll end up with like that. And of course you've got the octave between the A note over there and the A note over there. And that's essentially how Wes Montgomery played his octaves, between those two strings. And he was making that shape that I'm doing right now, except instead of sounding the D note on the B string, he's actually just using the index finger to mute the B string. So there's the low notes, while still sounding the high note with the pinky. And so you would end up with that characteristic Wes Montgomery octave sound. And that's the Wes Montgomery octave sound in a nutshell. Now you can move that across the different courses of strings. He did relatively rarely move them over one string, which you would maintain the same shape. And again, he's using the index finger to both sound the lower note and to mute the adjacent string, the next higher string, while hitting the higher note with his pinky. So you can do that on the D and the B strings. But actually, Wes Montgomery didn't tend to do that much. He tended to stick with the G and the E octaves. And when he wanted lower notes, he would actually move it over to the A and the G strings again. So he would get this sound. Now this shape is a little bit different because it doesn't involve the B string, which, as you know, is tuned differently relative to the other strings. It's tuned flatter relative to the other strings. So what that means is that instead of making the longer stretch with the pinky, you can do it with the ring finger, and you're actually just 2 frets apart instead of 3, which is what you would be if you were doing a stretch across the B string. So again, across the G and the E string, that octave is this stretch of 1, 2, 3 frets. Those are octaves. If you're doing it across the D and the B string, you're again using that same longer stretch. Right? But if you're moving it over, again, not involving the B string, you're not using that longer stretch. And that's basically the only two types of octaves that Wes Montgomery tended to use. Funny thing though, if you extrapolate the shape that Wes is playing, he's still making that D chord. He's still making that D shape, is what I mean. Because this note, the octave of it on the G string there, that A note, the octave of it is the open A. So anyway, he's just moving around that D chord. He's just sounding the lower note with the index finger, generally on the G string, and he's muting the B string. You can hear my spring reverb there. He's muting the B string with that same index finger, and he's sounding the octave with the pinky. Anyway, I hope that helps you play like a little bit like Wes Montgomery.